open up. You OPN, bitch, you want BBM.
Hey Matias.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming. Extremely honored to have you here now. I told you before the interview that I'm really impressed with your background. I'm impressed with what you're doing. So I really expect to have an awesome chat with you. So let's start with a question that I usually ask all my guests with. The first one, how can you identify yourself? Who are you in few words?
Yeah, and thank you again for having me. And I think the first question is an important question and one that I strive to move away from, in the idea that our identities are much more than what we do. And so I use the title of changemaker to really resonate with what I do in terms of the impacts I have, as opposed to the activities that I do or the titles that I hold and so forth. So the change-making title really resonates because I can really talk to people about the things that I have been able to do and the impacts that it has on people and the planet. And that's what drives me. What drives me is to make an impact on others and to really help people achieve greatness. So to me, the whole identity thing is more focused on impact as opposed to a title. And so when people ask me what I do, I say I do a lot of things. It's more of what is the impact of what I do that I go towards when I have conversation.
Okay, I love it. So you mentioned that now you kind of use the word changemaker, right? Well, at least this is what I saw when I explored your social media. So you're making changes, you're making impacts, and that's a big thing. So when was that moment when you realized that you are willing to make a change? When you realized that you have enough confidence, efforts, and sources to make a change, actually to start doing this?
I don't know if I ever realized that in a spur of the moment. I believe that is a process in itself. Along my trajectory in the last 15, 20 years of school, working in different environments, different jobs, different titles, I realized that what really gravitates most to me is being creative and being in positions to unleash my creativity, and that there wasn't a set position or title where I could do that, and I could play in many different environments, if you will. And I think early on, when I had the opportunity to use my skill set and my creativity to benefit others, I realized, or I came to realization that what I do matters. And that what I do not only matters, but what I do is also a responsibility that I have. So when I have skills or when I have opportunities to do something, it's not just an opportunity, but it's also a responsibility that I have to consider I have to consider in greater lengths. So to me, that is something that drives me, knowing that each of us as an individual has an opportunity to impact the greater whole. And that's not just an opportunity, but again, a responsibility. And that drives me, and I think that that's been instilled for me from an early age. I never really reflected on that until later on in life, and I think that's what drives me now to think of myself as a change maker, and to do that in a way that considers responsibility for others and for the planet. One of my things that I like to talk about now is moving away from equality as something that is between humans, and considering equality as something between every living thing and beyond. And that's where I believe we need to move the needle when we talk about change making. The responsibility is not just to make life better for other humans, but also to consider that we are in an ecosystem that has many more species and living things, and that require also our attention. And it's becoming more apparent, certainly in popular discourses, but I really value the responsibility that brings on.
Okay, so taking a responsibility. Do you think that change starts with yourself? There is this popular phrase, instead of going out there and changing the world, start with yourself.
It's a good question. Should you feel guilty about not making change? Should you feel that you need to start in order for others to do so as well? It's a loaded question.
I know.
Because we.
And it was not planned. It's just.
Yeah, no, and it's a great question. The short answer is yes. You should live in a way that you want others to also, or the world to be, I guess, is. I know there's other quotes around this, but the idea here being that envisioning the world that you want to live in or see, and then making it happen through your everyday actions. So that would be the understanding that you should live in a way that you want others to also live. We have to consider that we are constrained, or we are shaped by our world that we live in, by society, the culture, the rules, the parameters. So all those things enable us to make decisions. And so we are not per se free to make choices and to live the way we think is. Even our ideal worlds that we think are ideal are constructed based on some understanding of the world and the cultures we live in, and that changes. So I think one of the other key things to always be open to is that even though today we believe there is an ideal and we strive towards that ideal, that could change, and that very well will change in the future for ourselves and for others. And so to be stuck to a certain way is also detrimental to your own growth and development, and the growth and development of society. So the other angle to look at it is from a more macro or societal lens, and say, okay, well, how can we create parameters or shape behavior so that certain outcomes are achieved? And so if you focus on that, sometimes you don't give as much attention to the individual behaviors, and you focus more on how can you shape others, right? And I think that has happened for me in my experiences in starting businesses, for example, and then shifting towards learning, understanding what drives others to start businesses and how they leverage their creativity to make a change. And in doing that, I move away from actually running and establishing businesses, and focusing more on helping others run, establish, operate businesses. And there's the I guess part of the challenge when you talk about, does it start at do you do it yourself, or do you help others do it? Do you look at it from an individual level or a macro level, right? So I won't go too much into the theoretical aspect further, but it is an interesting question, and hopefully that gives some idea.
And I love the answer, absolutely.
There's no right answer, baby.
There's no right answer, but that was really well said. We touched base on the business topic here. So we met the networking event about the social entrepreneurship. So I met you as a social entrepreneur, and could you kind of explain in your own words, what does that mean? Because I guess that's a question for many of us. What is social entrepreneurship?
Right, and it's a question that's become more and more prevalent in our society, of importance in our society, and there's reasons for it. So social entrepreneurs are not new per se, or they're not. It's not something of the 21st century, perhaps. Or of this decade, or the last couple of decades. Social innovation has existed for a long time. I think what's become more apparent in today's days is the need for people and groups of people to organize their change making around business venture or business formation. So when we talk about social entrepreneurs, to me it's individuals or groups of individuals who are after social impact and change, and they do it through business formation.
Okay.
So, in a nutshell, it's impact in venture formation. There's others who would suggest that it requires, certainly from a venture formation perspective, sustainability. financial and other forms of sustainability. I would go more broad, more at a higher level, and just say that it's really about enacting social change through venture formation.
Absolutely. So social change plus business can be sustainability or financial finance.
Sure.
Okay, explains, answers my question. Yes, in order to understand why are you doing this, we need to go back a little bit. We need to look, I guess, into your educational background. What were you doing before? So can you talk a little bit about yourself? Like, where did you study academically? What projects did you start with? Like, how did you become who are you now?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I appreciate you asking that, because I think to me, I find it very interesting to understand the backgrounds of people, to understand the impacts they strive to have and so forward. For me, I immigrated to Canada when I was 10 years old, and when I came here, I found it much easier to integrate, to learn a new language, and to stay healthy relatively because of my age, because of opportunities I had through school, and through sport, and through recreation. And those opportunities, I didn't see those opportunities offered to adults, particularly in and through my parents. And I think a lot of other adult immigrants would share in that when you come to Canada, your primary objective is to integrate economically. And so to get a job, maybe two jobs, if you have children, you have to take care of them. And as a result of that, not as much attention is given to cultural integration, for people to learn about culture or Canadian culture and the way that things are done here. And there is interest, I think, from people to do that. And so for me, that's been my driver from early on. So in high school, and I was not necessarily much interested in the math or the technology or the physics, but I had a lot of interest in sociology subjects and sport. And I think that's where I gravitated towards in my university, was to study the relationship between the two, and the relationship between sport and integration of immigrants. And I started with some studies in my undergrad, and I remember my sociology of sport class, which was I would say, one of my most important instigators for doing what I do, because it really started putting together the pieces about what I experienced and some of the gaps that I identified. And that's what really drove me to then start my first venture. While I was doing a master's, I was aware that there was a gap in terms of providing immigrant adults with opportunities to meet other people in the community, to learn Canadian skills in sports. So we take it for granted sometimes that that we in Canada do things like skiing and ice skating in the winter. A lot of countries don't have those sports or infrastructure or weather to do those activities. And if you asked an adult to go on the ice and try skating, they'd probably say no, because they'd be afraid of falling and breaking something or hurting themselves and then not being able to work. And so my first venture was really about addressing that, about helping adults who come from other countries learn Canadian skills in sport and recreation, and building networks so that they could meet others and do these activities with them. And in doing so, promoting their health. We have, there's a thing here in Canada called the healthy immigrant effect, where immigrants who come as adults have better health before than after. So their health deteriorates with time in Canada, which doesn't make sense if you think about the better healthcare system they might have here, and socioeconomic opportunities and so forth. But when we look a little deeper, things like lack of networks and skills to do physical activity becomes an important gap to address. So that's where I set out to do my first venture, and at the same time support it with research. So I did my master's research looking at multicultural policies in Canada and how they are lacking in sport and recreation policies. So when you look at, for example, community recreation centers, they do not have a multicultural policy. In a democratic society, they meet the needs of the majority. So minority needs are necessarily not addressed by these public entities. So somebody like me comes in and meets for those needs, the way I just explained to you with the first venture I created, by establishing a venture that brought people together and gave them the skills and so forth. And along the way, you start identifying, well, why is that the public sector is not providing for these needs, and why is multicultural policies not part of sport and recreation when they're a central tenet of the national? It's a federal policy, and so there is a multicultural policy that impacts a number of other areas of life in Canada, but for some reason when it comes to sport and recreation, it's absent. So that led me to do more research so I went from a master's and from establishing a successful venture to saying, I'm not content with this, that's not enough for me. I need to let my creative juices go forward and find another route to find life. And so my next route was to do a PhD, where I looked more closely at immigrant entrepreneurs who were starting businesses to help with the social, cultural integration of newcomers. When I look at the literature, which was, I think, an interesting exercise in itself, immigrant entrepreneurs are studied in terms of their economic impacts. And that makes sense when in Canada we bring in primarily immigrants to benefit the economics of Canada. We talk a lot about the multicultural in terms of the different ethnic, racial backgrounds and the various different practices that immigrants come. But when we look at their businesses, we really judge them in terms of how many jobs they create, how much labor integration they're doing for themselves and others, what kind of economic impact they have in terms of tax base and so forth. We don't consider necessarily the impacts they have on building communities, on creating spaces for people to meet, and creating opportunities for people to learn new skills. And that's what I want to do in my PhD. I am not I guess if you would ask me before I started my PhD, is this something that you're strong at, the research and the academic side of things? And no, by no means. I thought of it as the biggest challenge I could take on, and that's what motivated me. I thought this is important to do, this important work. This is something that I feel very important about, something that I've experienced myself, and there needs to be more documentation and better understandings of how immigrants, through their business formation, are creating inclusive communities for newcomers and for established residents to develop into a cohesive community. And that's what I wanted to do. And I had, many times where I wanted to quit, many times where I thought this is the worst thing I could be doing. But what kept me going was this idea that this is important work, and the challenges was going to help me grow and develop as an individual as well, and it surely did.